So welcome, thank you for coming today to Queer Stories. My name is Stephen and I am the library's Children's and Youth Services Coordinator, and I'm joined today by some lovely library colleagues. So Fiona, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Fiona McGregor and I look after the online services for the library. So I look after the website, but also all databases and how people can get into them, and including these ones that we're going to be talking about today. And I also help to purchase some of the LGBT books that we'll be talking about later on this afternoon. So yeah, and this is Mary.
Yes, I'm Mary. I'm a team member out at Te Awe Library in town, though up until very, very recently I was at Johnsonville Library in the north. So team members do everything, sing to babies, read stories, issue books, all that sort of stuff.
And we have Alison.
Yeah, I'm also a team member. I work at Kuru Library Translation.
Yeah. Yay. And we have Millie, who works here at Newtown Library, and we have Wesley, who works out at Waitohi as well in Johnsonville, and we have the inimitable Paul on the camera. So, today we're going to be talking a little bit about some ways to discover LGBT stories, history, culture and experience using the library. So I'm sure that you guys probably already have some experience of this, but there are some really, really interesting resources that the library makes available to you through your library cards that you might not know about already. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about those at the beginning, and we're going to share with you some of the cool things that we've discovered, some really interesting things even about our local LGBT environment here in Wellington. And then we're going to break for a little bit, eat some more cupcakes and some cookies, and we're going to finish up with the movie. So we'll talk a little bit more about what the movie will be when we get closer to it. But what do you say we just get started, Fiona?
Sounds good.
Excellent. So the first major resource that I want to talk about with you guys is called the Gale Archive of Sexuality and Gender. And this is a really significant resource for a number of reasons. It's basically the single largest sort of online repository of information, magazines, periodicals, photographs, bits of creative writing, ephemera, posters, advertisements, really anything that you can think of that might relate in some way to LGBT history, culture, society through the ages is in this archive in some way, shape or form. And when we first got access to this in 2019?
It was 2019.
In 2019, we were actually the first public library in the world to offer access to it through your library card. So Fiona, do you want to give us a little bit of more background about the archive and also how people can actually find it on the website?
Yeah. So it's part of our online services. We generally group them under e-library, and we have a whole lot of other services under there. We've got the e-books that we're going to be talking about, but we also have other resources as well. And we have around about 70 different databases that people can access through the website just by using your library card and PIN number. And these were purchased on behalf of the people of Wellington, our library members, and so you don't have to pay anything to use them. The rates that the people of Wellington pay cover it all, so that's really good. So as with the other things that we have on the e-library, you can just go to the e-library page, and when you click on the drop down from the website, which is wcl.govt.nz, just do it by topic, and then when you have a look at the range of different topics there, just choose social comment, and the top one there is archives of sexuality and gender. Yeah.
So the archives actually it contains 4 quite different collections, and we'll just talk really briefly about what they cover and the sort of breadth and depth that they contain. And then we'll work through some really cool examples of bits and bobs that we've found within the archives. And of course, the idea is that hopefully after this, you guys will be inspired and excited to go home and have a search for yourselves and find out what kinds of stories you can trace through this archive. So the first part is LGBTQ history and culture since 1940. And this is really a general repository. It contains a lot of information from Europe, from the UK, from the US, the second part I want to make special mention of has the same title as the first part, but it contains the Canadian Lesbian Gay archives, which are interesting because they actually contain a significant amount of material that's relevant to New Zealand. Do you want to say anything more about that second part there, Fiona?
So I guess one of the, and just to dip back as well, is that we first purchased it in 2019, and purchased the first 3 parts of it, but we've since purchased part 4, but part 2, with the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, they had a really kind of wide mandate for what they collected. So in 2019, when I had a look for top twins, I thought, let's have a look and see, because you know, the top twins went everywhere. So, and there they were, there was a poster, you can't quite see it here, but there was actually a poster for the homosexual law reform event that happened at Wellington Town Hall in the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. So there's all kinds of really nifty things in there that you quite accidentally stumble across. So, you know, it's quite a wide collection.
Yeah. The third part is called Sex and Sexuality from the 16th through the 20th centuries. And we won't dwell on it for too long, but there's some deeply, deeply interesting stuff in here. It predominantly covers material that was held in the British Library's private case. These are collections of materials that were considered to be obscene and were banned from general circulation in the United Kingdom from the 16th century through to the sort of early 1900s. So some really interesting erotic literature, some interesting non-fiction, some poetry, some plays, some really interesting medical texts as well. It also contains the archives of the Kinsey Institute, which was the first sort of major scientific institute to undertake study into sexology, into gender, into sexuality. So the Kinsey Institute's archives, all the original research is held within this part 3 here as well. Part 4 is the kind of most relevant part to us here in New Zealand. So, international perspectives on LGBTQ activism and culture. This contains a really large amount of material, especially from Asia Pacific, from New Zealand, from Australia. And Fiona, I think that you have some stuff to talk about in relation to part 4. But before we get there,
Yes.
I thought it'd be worth outlining why this is an interesting and potentially useful repository of information. So it offers a really interesting cross-cultural perspective on the study of sexuality and gender across the world, across history, even going back into the Middle Ages in some cases. It provides multiple perspectives on LGBTQ communities and their experiences, with a particular focus on the second half of the 20th century and beyond. So there's a real concentration of literature and magazines and periodicals and stuff that were collected sort of in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, which of course is a really significant period in LGBTQ history in many countries around the world. So the archives takes a particular focus on that period. It offers really detailed and primary first-hand accounts of key figures and movements in LGBTQ history. So chances are, you know, if there's an event or a happening or a person that you've heard of, who knows, their personal writings might be in this archive, posters and pamphlets and flyers from those events might be in the archives. There's a really, really interesting and diverse range of material that's in here. It brings those really rare and really hard to find materials out into the open, where they're not, hitherto they've been really difficult to source if you're not like a fancy academic person with access to like a university library repository. So yeah, it's just, it makes convenient the process of discovering all this interesting stuff.
Right. So yeah, the part that I'm going to talk about is part 4, which is the newest part that's been added. And amongst all of the features that Stephen's mentioned, this part really kind of concentrates on the archives coming from Southern Africa, but also Australia as well. And struggles for rights and freedoms, the different organisations there, and the history, and then particularly countering the erasure of the stories and experiences of LGBTQ people from official history. So, want to go to the next one? Yeah. So what does this really mean? So one of the things that I'm particularly pleased about that's in here is the Australian Lesbian and Gay archives periodicals. So some people might have read in the past Lesbians on the Loose, or as it's called, Lottle, generally. Outrage, Gazette, but also Camp New South Wales newsletter. There's also posters from the Mardi Gras there, or within those different magazines. So the West Campaigner, so from Perth as well, and from Adelaide as well. But there's all kinds of different things. The wonderfully named Pink Fire Scenes from Hobart, and the fabulous Fruit Juice, aka tropical fruits from Lismore, New South Wales. So the other thing that I thought was really great about this as well is that, as we know, until recently, of course, New Zealanders travelled a lot to Australia. So there's actually, and also Australian magazines also profiled what was happening here in New Zealand as well. So there is New Zealand happenings here, particularly the different types of the Alton Park and things like that. So that's what's really neat about that, is being able to provide this access. One of the other features about it as well was the Gala Centre archives, including the Exit newspaper it was formerly called Link, and so it was South Africa's longest running monthly LGBTQ publication. But there's also the archives from particular people in Southern Africa as well, the papers of Simon Siko Nikoli and Sexual Minorities Uganda. And if you know anything about Ugandan politics, you'll know that, in fact, the situation for the LGBTQ community in Uganda has been very difficult. The Association of Bisexual Gays and Lesbians, as well in South Africa, and the papers of Joy, Well Beloved. So Gala, where these papers come from, is a centre for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and questioning culture and education in Southern Africa. So they've really got a big mandate to collect widely, much as the other groups have. And Gala was set up to address the erasure of stories and experiences of people in South Africa. And the history of politics in South Africa has certainly been difficult, for some time. So I think it's really, really important that these papers do become available. But lastly, and actually kind of most interesting for me, was the Lesbian History Archives. I visited the archives in Park Slope in Brooklyn, and had a look at their overwhelming badges collection that they have, and all kinds of vertical files and things like that. Well, a lot of the material there from their vertical files called Lesbians In, and were covering all kinds of different countries around the world, like Poland, also Uganda, other areas around the world as well. So, and when I remember those those brimming kind of files that they had there, it's just so wonderful to think that the archives of gender and sexuality is actually enabling the access to these papers. They also have a lot of community organisations files as well from around the US as well, and also the Two-Spirit communities in the US as well. And one of the things that we did find from that time, from looking in these papers, is a wonderful thing called On the Land, which was written, we think, around about 1990, but it's actually from Urinui in Taranaki, and it's written, so this is actually from a newsletter that was in the the Lesbian History Archives. Kia ora, we are 3 vegan, sober, lesbian separatists living on lesbian-owned land in Taranaki, Aotearoa. We have about 20 acres of land here with our 2 acres in gardens and orchard, and our whare, sleeping house and kitchen. The rest of the land is native bush, regenerating bush, and a few acres of pine trees. And they go on to talk about the climate and about how they're growing plums, tamarillo, apples, nectarines, peaches, apricot, citrus, sapote, I don't know what sapote is, and Chinese gooseberries, as of course we now know as kiwi fruit. So, and there's photos here, and it's wonderful. And it was actually published in the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance archives. So there really truly is information from right around the world in these archives, and even just back here in Aotearoa. So yeah.
Yeah, I love the thought. Well, first of all, that there's like a sort of anarcho-feminist lesbian commune in Taranaki as recently as 1990, but also that it was kind of significant enough that it made it into an archive in Atlanta of all places. It kind of speaks to, I think, a particular vision that people from overseas have about New Zealand as kind of a bit of a sort of paradisical sort of location for queer people, which of course it isn't and hasn't always been, but certainly in comparison to some other countries, it could be viewed that way. So I just find it really, really fascinating. I love that story about about that group in Taranaki. It's just so cool.
Exactly.
So I want to show you a little bit of the inner workings of the archive, and then Mary and Alison have some interesting things to show you. So two things to be aware of when you sort of enter into this archive for the first time is that while you can of course search it like Google, sort of use keywords and things like that, sometimes there are better ways to make use of the archive search features that will give you more interesting and more kind of holistic results. So one of the really interesting search tools that I found was this term frequency searcher. So basically what this allows you to do is to take any term, but of course the more interesting ones are sort of areas where we know that terminology has shifted over time and the usage of words has shifted over time. And it basically just shows you the frequency of that word's usage in the literature through history. So starting at 1990 on the left and running through to 2020 on the right. And this particular search was for the word transgender. So there's a bit of an artificial spike in the 1930s. Of course, the word transgender wasn't in wide use in the 1930s, but there is some material that is housed in archives that include the word transgender in their name, so that will be why those results are coming up. But you do see a really, really massive spike in usage of the word transgender around sort of the early 1990s, and of course coming into today. So the word enters common parlance around 1990, or that's when it starts being used in sort of literature, and becomes much more common into the 2000s and 2010s. Of course, you would get a very, very different spread of the graph if you used a different word, like say, for example, transsexual. You would have a completely different curve, right? So that sort of will show how the usage of that word has changed over time as well. And Alison, you found some interesting things when you searched for bisexual as well, right?
Yeah, so there's this podcast that I like called The Illusionist, and they had someone as a guest once on it that talked about the way that the word bisexual has been in use for quite a while in sort of English language, but it has been used for something completely not to do with sexuality, and it used to sort of just mean basically, it was just another word for like unisex basically. And so there's a lot of hilarious examples in sort of like the 1800s, for example, where they're referring to like objects as being like bisexual objects and that sort of thing. And so you can actually find proof of that in these archives. If you look actually outside of the gender and sexuality archives in the other Gale archives that we have access to through the library, there's results that come up that say like bisexual churches or things like that. Yeah, so that's a good example of like being able to trace like the linguistics of things. And it's also quite interesting to compare, like, say, if you search for words like transgender in the gender and sexuality archives, you can see a very different curve to, say, looking at more mainstream archives in the other Gale archives that aren't the sexuality ones. Yeah, you can see very different curves where people are using those using terminology, say, to describe themselves in their own communities. They're doing that a lot more frequently and a lot earlier than, say, in mainstream publications.
Yeah. You see a really interesting lag where, of course, in publications that are specifically by, for, and about, LGBTQ+ people, that the language changes in those communities well before the language changes in sort of mainstream communities and mainstream publications. So it is interesting to compare those kind of those curves. It's a very nerdy thing, but
Yeah.
librarians love that kind of stuff.
There's one other cool feature that you can do is that you can see, if you see at the top that says add row, you can
Yeah.
add different terms that might mean similar things, and you can
Yeah.
compare the curves as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can have a look at that a little bit later on.
Yeah.
The next thing that I just wanted to show, because it's a really practical thing, is because the archives cover the entire world, with of course particular focuses on particular areas, it can be quite overwhelming and quite difficult to actually localise New Zealand content, for example, if that's something that you're looking for. So it is very good to know that you can search by publication location, which is a super useful sort of option. And so, for example, this was a search for just items published in New Zealand, and it has a list of regular publications, not including monographs, so not sort of like one-off publications, but for any ongoing publications like newsletters or newspapers or magazines, it'll bring up all of those that were published in New Zealand. So there are some super interesting ones here, like Bitches, Witches and Dykes, a women's liberation paper which was published in Auckland around the 1980s. And there's some super interesting stuff in there we might have a look at that was around the Springboks tour and the kind of radical lesbian feminist response to that was really fascinating. The Circle, Gay Lib News, Gay Liberator, Network, Out, Pink Triangle, a whole range of protocols that you guys might have heard of and might have actually even seen in publication, especially Pink Triangle was going into fairly recently. But here you can find their back catalogue, and it's really fascinating to see how their publications, in some cases, shifted from being purely underground sort of distributions to, like in the case of Pink Triangle, being a bit more like you could potentially find it in some, news sellers. So I'll just come out of the presentation momentarily so I can show you the actual archive itself. So this is the Archive of Sexuality and Gender homepage, and to do that term frequency search that I mentioned just before, if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see here the 4 different archives. So the perspectives, which contains a lot of the New Zealand stuff, the part 1, part 2, which contains a lot more New Zealand stuff, and the Canadian archives, and the sort of slightly racy private case British Library collection on the far right there. But if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, then you can use this term frequency searcher here, and go ahead to re-log in. This is fine. I'm sure you will memorize your library card numbers as well. Okay, so what are some terms that might be interesting to sort of read about or see how the frequency has changed over time? Any suggestions? Millie? Furries. Let's see.
Don't call me out here.
That's cool. All right, so let's see. Yeah.
Does it
An interesting
discriminate
slide.
plurals?
So we might actually test that out if we add a row and search as well for furries. Oops. So we'll see if there's a difference here. And I'll also toggle over to popularity search there on the right. What that means is it takes into, if you click the popularity toggle rather than the frequency toggle, it means that it will account for the number of publications in each given year. So like so it'll be a percentage-based figure rather than a pure number-based figure. So it should, in some cases, give you a slightly more accurate visualization. So furry versus furries.
Oh no.
Wow.
Wow.
A fascinating spike in 1877. One can only speculate as to what they might be. You can actually click on it any individual year and it will bring up a list of every document in which that particular term was used in that year. So let's see, the term furry was used in this publication. Index librorum prohibitorum, being names bio, biblio, iconographical and critical on curious and uncommon books. So, who knows what that will be about? I suppose we could click on it and find out. So, it's a book from 1877 that is 600 and something pages long. So it could be a little tricky to track down exactly where the term furry appears in this publication.
600-page index.
Yeah.
Wait, index.
Yes, a 600-page index of weird books, basically. The Victorians were interesting people. So as you can see, it has like full-page, extremely high-resolution scans, but you can, if you choose, do a plain text instead to kind of reduce loading times. So it's attempts to capture the OCR for all the pages. I can find a page that actually has some text on it, a bunch of Latin gibberish. Here we go. A nation's books are her vouchers, her libraries are her monuments. Her wealth of gold and silver, whether invested in commerce or bonds or banks, is always working for her, blah, 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 blah. Classic Victorian stuff. Let's see where the word furry appears. Hopefully somewhere. Oh yeah, 427, 428, yeah.
Furry coat
yeah.
of whitish.
Yeah, furries.
Ah,
Okay, so
here
we can
go.
see a slightly different usage to the usage we were expecting to be searching for. Whoops. Yeah. But anyway, that gives you kind of a bit of a taster as to how you can use that term frequency searcher to do some kind of interesting drilling down. So, I mean, we could probably have predicted that any document we brought up from the year 1877 about furries was probably not going to be exactly what we were expecting to find. So were we to open a document from like 2014? Right?
I've got a good one that you could do that I know.
Yeah.
Has, so if you do 2 rows, and one as gender queer, and one as gender non-conforming,
Okay.
that's a hybrid one to see the use of different
Yeah.
words over time.
Good idea. So we'll do gender queer and gender non-conforming. Right, let's see how we go here. Yeah. So there you can see at the ends quite a spike. So the blue line is for gender queer and the black line is for gender non-conforming. So according to this, at least in terms of frequency, there appears to be something of a spike of gender queer in the 2000s, which I would say correlates to my experience of that term as well. And then gender non-conforming has a more general spread of usage across the decades and centuries, but with a particular spike in the sort of 1970s and into late 1990s. But it is still in usage in some places today as well. So yeah, it's a good example, Elsa. Thank you.
But yeah, I think that's how you can use it.
Yeah. So that's one sort of interesting feature of the tool. So I'll pop back across to the presentation now, and let's see who was up next. Right at the beginning of this. Apologies all. Okay. Mary, what interesting things have you discovered in the archive?
Well, if we could go back into the actual archive,
Yes.
so we can sort of mimic some searching I did, which was, I work in a library, I like books, I like words, so I thought I would try and have a go at finding some sort of creative writing and also maybe some publications that were maybe only aimed at that. If you go down to the topic finder, which we haven't looked at yet, it's down the bottom, topic finder, which I was playing with because it looks cool. It brings up this like little tiled grid that groups all the different topics that you're looking for together. And so I was just going through a bunch of keywords about different publication-related things. Stumbled upon the word press. So if you could search press there. And we'll see the beautiful visual result come up in its glorious colours.
Wow.
Yeah. And so now if we go into book publishing, that red one there, I looked through this, and if you look on the right side there, you see a very interesting one to me, which was Braille press, which I thought looked very interesting.
Yeah.
So the third result there, we could
Women's
click on that.
Braille pressing.
Yes. And it should, once it appears, be a explanation of the Women's Braille Press. Offers over 75 feminist and lesbian books on tape to women who are blind or physically disabled. It also circulates several other feminist periodicals on tape. So I think that's cool. I mean, it's great to try and make as many materials as possible accessible to people who are actually interested in reading them. So then I just did a general search for Women's Braille Press. So if we just do that up the top.
And that's women with a Y, right?
Yes, women with a Y. And then go down to newspapers and periodicals and just open up that
First one?
list. No, not the first one, the whole list. I did look through a few things, but the 16th entry, that's why I have notes, is their newsletter. So if we go to the publication rather than that particular newsletter, I just want to first look at the very first issue of that. So the 1980
January 1st,
first one
1980.
there. And this is the first newsletter that they published. And as we can see, it is 3 pages long. And it sort of introduces them as 5 blind women. Some of them are lesbians, all of them are feminists, and they're just trying to get more lesbian books and feminist books out there. And it does say on the last page that if you're unable to help in any way, please recirculate this leaflet. So obviously they didn't have too much of a budget in that they were sort of using their very newsletter, sending it throughout a whole lot of people. But now if we go back to the list, and we'll have a look at one of the more recent ones, the 1992 one. Maybe not the very, very last, and the August one, why not? So it's 12 years later. It's now 18 pages long.
They've got graphics now.
Yeah, got graphics, much more professionally created.
Yeah.
And the last few pages too are a list of different publications that they have made available during the period between the last 2 newsletters. Both books on tape that they get they would get volunteers to record on tape in their houses, and also books they published in Braille themselves. I think in the next year they were victims to their own success in that there were so many feminists and lesbians who wanted to read these books that they had so many volunteers, but I think they only had maybe 1 or 2 paid members of staff. So I think did a bit of looking at how they were working and did end the Women's Braille Press, I think at that point in 1993, just because it was too much work for them to do as a voluntary role, organising all of this as well as juggling their own lives and actually making money as well. But I thought that the success they had in those 13 years was something really cool to look at, and there are some very interesting snippets to read in some of the different newsletters. Like they introduce themselves, like a sort of staff spotlight, and a couple of one particular letter written by a volunteer who's saying, we record books for one of our blind friends and don't want to have to buy tapes anymore, so I guess we could record for you, but it's going to be very difficult adhering to your standards because we're used to leaving out boring footnotes and adding in interesting comments to our friends. So, we'll try do that. But yeah, we think you're doing a good thing, but it'll be a bit different to what we're used to. So this was in America, by the way, and I just thought it was a very cool thing that a group of 5 blind women, some of them lesbians, all of them feminists, did in the 80s and 90s.
Cool.
And then something I'm not going to show on screen, because I believe we're keeping this not R-rated.
We found a lot of questionable poetry that we've
Yes, a lot
chosen
of
not to
questionable
share.
So I've chosen a poem that I'm going to read out that is not R-rated, but unfortunately on the same page as that poem in the publication that it's in, there is a lot of poetry that is R-rated. So if you want to, you can feel free to go in and look this up later.
Excuse me, I've got another commitment, guys.
Yeah.
Well done, thank you.
So the one I've chosen to share is from a publication called Gay Scotland, from the January/February issue of 1987, written by a poet called H.J.C., so a pseudonym of some sort, and it is called Cats. I have tried many times to write a poem on the cats I have known and loved, or merely met in passing and admired, and perhaps exchanged a civil word or two. But I have never succeeded in describing even one aspect of one cat. Their paws neatly, arrogantly treading filthy pavements and silken carpets with a like aloofness, the alert ears like furred shells, and most of all their eyes like running water, lit with green and gold, calm, unjudging, godlike they stare, untamed, refusing dependence, intrinsically wild, yet civilized. No, cats are indescribable. It is better so. I believe that poet was a regular contributor to Gay Scotland magazine. Every 3rd issue they put aside a page for all the poetry that people would submit, and some of them were, as Stephen said, in the archive there is a lot of questionable bad poetry or questionable R-rated poetry, but also a lot of really, really great stuff. Like, there was one that I decided not to read that was about sort of a man mourning the loss of his ex-lover. So, a lot out there to find.
One of those very interesting publications was set in a library.
It was set in a library.
Yes, we shan't sully the profession so.
But if you want to search for a poem titled In the Library, we can't stop. And then I guess the last thing I have to share with you is another search, which was, this is an event that's part of Wellington Pride. And Wellington Pride sort of grew from the Newtown Lesbian and Gay Fair that was first held in 1986. So I wanted to see if there was anything that was published that was about the Lesbian and Gay Fair in 1986, and I found two things really. It didn't get too much of a note. Did a search for keywords Newtown and Fair, place of publication New Zealand, and before 1987, and came up with the Out magazine. It's quite an Auckland focus, but once it loads, we can see in the Outs Roundup section, second paragraph there, a recent lesbian and gay fair held in Newtown was a resounding success, netting $2,300 for the Wellington Gay Task Force funds, which is pretty impressive. And then if we also go to page 44,
There's only 40 pages in this one, Mary.
ooh,
Page on the side should.
yes,
I don't know.
we come to the capital comment, and in a very short paragraph near the end, we mentioned again, in Newtown, the gay bazaar showed that people's hearts were still in the right place, as much more than just money was raised at this first, and certainly not the last, gay fair. So that's where Wellington Pride started, and now it's much more than these 2 paragraphs appearing in a Auckland-based queer magazine. Certainly grown a lot. That's all I've got to share.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
Alison, I think that you're up next.
Yeah. So I was kind of thinking about what my angle could be when Stephen approached us and said, go find things in the archives to put down. There's many rabbit holes to go down. The one that I ended up going down, which was pretty fun, was I found that you could search by type of publication, and one of the options were letters to the editor. So that's where I sort of like focused on. I read probably about 60 something issues of letters to the editor, mostly in Out magazine, and yeah, I just went and looked for ones that were like funny or interesting. I found a lot from the 80s that are very, very outdated, or sometimes not. Sometimes they're quite relevant to today. But yeah, I have them on my phone, so I'm just gonna find them and read them out. So most of them I found in Out magazine because, say for example, Pink Triangle, I found that a lot of the kind of letters to the editor, they were very like practical, or I don't know, they sort of weren't like the slice of life kind of stuff that existed in the in Out magazine. There were some sort of limitations to that, and Out magazine was definitely, even though it said it was kind of for like everyone in the queer community, it was definitely focused mainly on gay men. And yeah, you definitely felt that when you read a lot of the letters to the editor. That sort of definitely stands out, that that's kind of like the main readership, and also like, yeah, that's what the editor is also choosing. The letters that they're choosing to publish as well, and the letters to the editor tend to reflect that. But yeah, there's lots of good stuff that I found. So yeah, some of them are really wholesome. There were quite a lot of nice ones that were wholesome, and just sort of like people saying that they were just really grateful to be able to, they're often from small towns, that sort of thing, and they were able to, I guess, feel connected to people, obviously in days before the internet, that sort of thing. These were kind of like the ways in which people kept in touch with each other, so kept up with the news and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's this one here. It says, Dear Wellington, I just wanted to say thank you for welcoming a new face to your city. Thank you for befriending a stranger. Thank you for making this the kind of place I, as a young gay, am proud to call my new home. As a New Zealander who left as a 2-year-old, you make it easy to say I'm proud to be a gay New Zealander. As a gay raised in Canada for 20 years, you show how open and willing you are to make one feel welcomed. This wonderful land I will be calling my home once more will make me proud to say I'm home. I only hope I can repay this kindness back to the community. Thank you, Kevin, Eric, Kerry, Paul, Graham, Carl, Mal, and the many others I'm proud to call friends. Wellington, you have something very special here for which I give you my love. Please don't lose it. So, there's nice things like that. Yeah. Okay, let me find some others to read out. Should I show you how I found these first, maybe? So I'll go into the archives. So if you go into advanced search, and then you go, so in that first one, type New Zealand, and the field will be place of publication. And then yeah, just search that. So that searches for all places, all things that are published in New Zealand. And then where it says filter your results, you go on the right hand side, you go document type, and then you click letter to the editor. So yeah, that's how I found it. It's about 700. And I just sort of, started going from there. Sort of the things I found most interesting about the letters to the editor were that you sort of get a history. It sort of reminds me of like Twitter, like before Twitter existed. You get this sort of like very informal, sort of like your average person's insight or, hot takes on things. It's kind of like if you read like 5 tweets a month or something. I feel like if we all did, probably would be better for our mental health. But yeah, so it kind of reminds me of, it feels very similar when I was reading them. But what was kind of interesting is that they often referred to things that were happening that I'd never heard of, or maybe were kind of, if you weren't around, I guess you might have no idea about it, or even if you were around at the time, maybe you've completely forgotten about, because it sort of refers to things very informally. It'll just be like, oh, when I went to this event the other day, and you'd be like, what was that? That sounds amazing. So I found this one that was referring to a cruise that happened in Auckland, like a gay cruise. And it says, "Dear Out, I am just recovering from what I feel must be the biggest gay happening this country has ever seen. And even though my head is still spinning, I just have to get a few words off to you as a way of saying thank you. In fact, a very large thank you. My friends had told me about previous Out magazine disco cruises, but this was my first. And what a first. Frankly, I didn't think it was possible to either enjoy myself so much or to keep going so long. Not only was the harbour cruise a real rage, but the breakfast disco at the Westside Sauna in the morning just blew my mind. You guys have it all made with places like that. The next time my 2 male flatmates say they are bored with the city, I intend to hit them over the head. Thank you, Out. When's the next one? Jenny from Auckland." I really want to know more. Yeah, disco cruise. I feel like that would still be successful today. I guess the cruise industry is not doing well. But, yeah. Okay, so I'll try and find some other ones. Okay. So one that I found, this is the one that I found the most amazing, I'll talk about it now, was I found reference to computer dating in the 70s. And I was shocked about that because I didn't know that that could be possible, but that was something that happened. And I'll try and, sorry, I've just got so many.
I think the graphics for this one
Yeah,
are so incredible. Computer cruising.
Yeah, so it's fascinating.
Yeah, I know.
Almost before I ever hit some music.
Yeah. 1979. The place, Auckland.
So I'll just read the article. I can't find the actual letter to the editor that refers to it. But this is the article. It says, "Computer dating has arrived on the gay scene. A young Auckland man has opened a computerized introduction service which caters solely for gays, a first for New Zealand. Available to both men and women, Friends," that's what it's called, Friends, as the club is called, operates right across New Zealand, and the organiser is already investigating an extension of the scheme to Australia. The club opened in mid-December, and while it is too early yet to accurately assess demand for this sort of facility, particularly in view of the awkward time of the year, Friends reports the response as most encouraging. Out talked to the organiser, who for various reasons of a personal nature declined to be named, and during the interview we were told that there were 2 main reasons for starting the scheme. Firstly, there seemed to be widespread dissatisfaction with the pub scene as the main areas for gays to meet one another. It still seems relevant. And secondly, computer dating is of itself an excellent way of meeting new friends, as proved by the schemes that operate for the heterosexual world. The spokesman for Friends told out that there is no earthly reason why people who happen to be gay should be restricted in their social life or even denied one entirely in many cases. Some people find it immensely difficult to meet others of a similar nature, and there again, others who are perhaps quite well adjusted simply do not meet as many potential new friends as they would like. This is particularly true of the smaller centres. It feels like these sort of concerns that they had about computer dating in 1979, they feel very, very similar to now. So they were really ahead of their time. It was an Auckland-based company that created this. I thought technology could go a long way towards solving a problem that persuasion and political action doesn't seem to be making too much progress with. Friends was certainly most carefully chosen as a name. Members have the freedom to define the sort of person they'd like to be put in contact with, and these are not necessarily potential lovers. It's quite interesting. It's sort of like a way of meeting just like people, you can sort of like, they called it Friends so that it was like open to whether or not they wanted to use it as dating or just meeting people. So that's kind of interesting. What I find the most amazing feature of this dating service that they had, well, the thing that I find quite ahead of its time was that you had to like know people who were already doing it, kind of thing. Sort of like, I guess they were vetted in the sense of how close to the circle you were, which I guess was maybe a way of ensuring people were safe doing it. But it kind of reminds me of like the way that, you know, Facebook, you can see how many like mutual friends you have with someone. So I thought that was quite ahead of its time. But the thing that I found amazing is that the way that it worked was that you answered 83 multiple choice questions about yourself, which the computer then processes. And 83 is quite a lot of questions to answer about yourself. That would take you a long time to answer that. Yeah. So, yeah, and then it computes it, and it sort of it matches you, I guess, based on how similar your responses are. I'm not sure how they were I don't know how computers worked in the 70s, but I'm sure like not with a lot of precision. I don't know, but yeah. Anyway, I just thought that was fascinating, and someone wrote in the letter to the editor. I found out about that article because of the letter to the editor that I read. And they had complaints about it. They were very concerned about the costs, because what I'm finding out now is that they were charging money for that service, and they were suggesting, I don't know if this is actually how much it costs, but they were suggesting that it costs $10 per match. So just imagine if, you know, using online dating apps that we use now, it costs you $10 every time matched with someone. It ends up becoming quite an expensive.
What year was that?
1979. Yeah.
How much is that now?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were suggesting that if they matched with people 200 times, that's $2,000. And they were horrified. I also appreciate that this person was considering that they would match with 200 people.
Yeah.
Kudos to them. Anyway, I just thought that was fascinating. I was really surprised when I found that. And it's the sort of thing that it disappears from collective memory. It sort of comes and it goes very quickly. Yeah. I have a few other things, but I don't have to go through all of them.
1979?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
You might not be able to find it unless you look in the archive or something.
$62.46.
Really?
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Better
That's a
hope
lot of
it's a
money to pay
successful
for a
match.
friend.
It is.
I love that though, and I mean, yeah, those letters to the editor is such a fascinating insight into people and culture, and as you say, that kind of like the casual sort of culture that, you know, referring to events, you know, the thing they went to yesterday, and you find out later it was some hugely significant, you know, in retrospect, kind of turning point in history or whatever. But there was one really interesting letter to the editor that I found in my searches, which was in Bitches, Witches and Dykes. I think it was January 1981, and it was basically a letter that they published that was clearly sent to them by someone who was very anti-lesbian, someone called Steve, and they published it just yeah, I know, and they published the letter just with the title, "Who is Steve and is he from Ponsonby?" I thought it was the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. So there's some really brilliant, just like absolute singers in that publication in particular. But anyway, let's get back on track. So yeah, the archive is a deeply interesting place, very easy to get lost there, and I highly recommend that you do. So again, you can access it with your library card, so your library card number and the 4-digit PIN number that you will have got when you signed up, which is normally the last 4 digits of the phone number that you gave us when you registered with the library. So the last little thing that we wanted to talk about just before we kind of eat lots of cupcakes is Overdrive, and I hope that you guys know about Overdrive. If you don't, it's one of our ebook platforms. And I asked the inimitable Wesley to provide me with a list of some of his favourites from our LGBTIQ+ reading room. So you can access Overdrive or Libby as it is in mobile app form. You can access the Overdrive website through the library main page. Just go to the e-library, ebooks, movies, newspapers, and there it is, Overdrive. Along the top bar there's a reading room called LGBTIQ+ Reads, which basically, well, Fiona has put a huge amount of work into maintaining this page. It has many hundreds of books, non-fiction, fiction, essays, poetry, audiobooks, regular textbooks, about memoirs, yes, super fascinating, teen reads as well, graphic novels, comics, things like that. All to do with LGBTIQ+ people, and so.
Oh, and also, if you have any suggestions for more books to go in there, then please do let us know. And through the Overdrive website, you can just type in which book you are interested in. If it comes up as recommend to library, then just click recommend to library, and we'll get an email and hopefully add it pretty soon.
And you can do that
Yeah. So please do recommend books to us. You know, chances are if it's available, we'll buy it. Yeah. So some books that Wesley recommended. Some of which, well, all of which you can find on Overdrive. Some of which you'll be able to find in physical form as well. The first one was is Bingo Love by T. Franklin, Jen St. Onge, and you've read this one, Fiona.
Yeah,
It's a really gorgeous graphic novel about 2 women who fall in love twice. Really beautiful art style as well. I can show you these books if you like. So let's bring up that cover. The next one that Wesley recommended, which I looked at because I thought it looked super cute, it's called Pause and Reflect, edited by Neil Palke and Sharon Saxton. 25 touching true stories about gay men and their dogs. I thought that was really adorable, especially given the beautiful poem about cats.
Yes.
That's Mary read us earlier, so clearly a real affinity for domesticated animals amongst the gays.
Also Wesley's proclivity for puns.
Yes, indeed. The next one, Stay Gold by Toby McSmith, a young adult novel about a transgender boy looking for a fresh start at a new high school and a blossoming romance. You can find a lot of these really beautiful young adult novels in the LGBTIQ+ reading room. And also, the wonderful Millie has curated a beautiful display of LGBT reading material at this very library, should you wish to borrow some and take it home today. The next book Legendary Children by Tom Fitzgerald and Lorenzo Marquez, a deep dive into the popular RuPaul's Drag Race series and the last century of queer life and culture. So a bit of a non-fiction expose there on RuPaul and co. Really beautiful cover to that book. Absolutely love it. And it's available. You can borrow it right now if you want to.
I think we have that in print as well.
We do,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
hard copy on the display.
Yes. And the truly excellent He's So Mask by Chris Teese. Do you all know of Chris Teese? I hope that you do. Really incredible Wellington poet. And He's So Mask is very nearly worn out on that bookshelf. It's an incredible book. But we've got some more poetry by local Wellingtonians on the shelf here, including a book of poems by a library staff member, Jackson Newlands. Yeah, called Being Human.
Yeah.
Yeah, a beautiful, beautiful book as well. And then the last book that was on Wesley's recommend to read list was Myth and Magic, Queer Fairy Tales, edited by Radcliffe and Stacia Seaman. Classic fairy tales with a queer twist. So some really gorgeous books you can find there. I'll just open up in Overdrive what the reading room looks like so that you can see all the interesting and cool stuff there. So this is LGBTIQ+ reads. A new addition is magazines. So unfortunately there are only 5 titles that we have access to at the moment, out of many thousands of magazines that you can access through Overdrive. But there's out, you can read some really interesting letters to the editor potentially and out. Diva, Gay Times, Advocate, Attitudes, the kind of, I guess the big 5 of sort of international queer magazine publishing at the moment. And then if you scroll down, you can see a bunch of other, oh my gosh, I just finished reading that. Dagny Rice and Colour. It's a pretty good one. Some non-fiction, some adult fiction.
And that's Bingo Love there actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Bingo Love, yeah. That beautiful graphic novel about the lesbian couple that falls in love twice. Teen reads, some absolute classics in there. Some biographies, including a bunch of really interesting biographies about New Zealanders. Of course, Witi Ihimata is very important, Māori boy and native son. Books on social issues, romance and erotica, LGBTQ crime novels. It is actually a surprisingly large section.
Crime-ance is a really big thing in reading. So
Absolutely. Essays and humour, and there's many thousands of books to choose from. So explore. We really recommend it. So the last little bit is just to mention to you before we break for cupcakes and other things, is that of course the archive and Overdrive are far from the only place where you can sort of discover queer stories, history, fiction, non-fiction, all that kind of stuff using the library resources. So this is just a list of some of the places where you can go using your library card. Obviously the physical collection is a huge one. In our collection of around 700,000 books, there's bound to be quite a few that touch on the queer experience. One of the really interesting ones that we had a hilarious encounter with in a meeting yesterday is the Oxford English Dictionary Online. Doesn't immediately look like it'll be a place where you can find out about the gays, but the OED Online is actually a really fascinating resource for tracking linguistics and the usage of language over time. Really, it's interesting to use it in conjunction actually with the archive, so you can see term frequency, and you can go to the OED and see the real nuance as to how that language was used at that time. The entire Vogue archive we hold online, going back to the 1890s.
the very first issue.
The very first editions of Vogue.
And it's digitised as well.
Yeah, all digital.
So it's kind of interesting when you have a look for example, transgender as a keyword, for example, in the Progress Vogue archive, just to kind of see the way that it's represented differently over the years in the Vogue archive. And again, it's, you can just go in and browse and just read see some of the fashion as well associated with the LGBT community, right from, the 20s right through, for example. Fascinating.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
I always forget that we have the Vogue archive, and then I get sucked into it for like a few days and emerge blinking at the ends like, where did I just go? The Australian New Zealand Reference Centre is like a sort of collection of newspapers predominantly from Australia and New Zealand, so a kind of interesting mainstream counterpoint, I guess, to the Gale archive of sexuality and gender. Press Reader, which is a repository of current magazines and periodicals, many thousands from around the world. Overdrive magazine we mentioned, a couple more Gale databases, global issues and contemporary women's issues in context. A database called Recollect, which is the library's collection of historical photographs and pamphlets and books and other documents to do with Wellington specifically. And there's some really, really interesting Wellington-specific stuff in there about, especially the trans community, through the sort of 1980s to the sort of late 90s. Some beautiful imagery there that we've been sort of highlighting throughout Pride. Canopy and Beamer Film as well. A lot of people still don't realise that we provide these two free streaming services. Think of them like, Netflix, but it's free. And Canopy has like 50,000 films on it, from documentaries through to sort of short films and indie flicks, and some pretty big names as well. And the film we're going to watch today is from Canopy. Beamer Film is smaller, but it contains kind of more localised content. It's an Australian company that does it, so there's more kind of South Pacific material you can find in Beamer Film, and they're both free for your library card.
And just about those two as well is that if you go in there, you can definitely kind of drill down, and they actually have an option to
Just to filter by LGBT cinema.
Yeah. So, and if you used to go to the Outtakes Festival here in Wellington years ago, some of the films that used to be on there are in there as well. So it's really cool.
Yeah, it is really, really cool.
Yeah.
LinkedIn Learning, which used to be called Lint.com, has some interesting sort of training modules in there for things like, workplace diversity and all that kind of stuff. The library, I made a little type for the library's team blog, which I run, which I'm trying to make the gayest blog on the library website, so you can check that out if you like. And you can find all that and more with your library cards. It's super easy, and we're always really happy to help you with it.
Yeah.
So let's take a bit of a break while we get the movie set up.
But just a plug before we do that, is that you can either come into the library to ask how to use any of these databases, or to fix up your library card if you're not sure what your PIN is, for example. Or if you're around and about and out in the centre or out in the city, it's going to be cool next week on Saturday, just come into Michael Fowler Centre, and we've got a stall there, and we'd be really happy to show you how to do any of replicate the search for the letters to the editor, or show you any of these things. So just give us a yell.
Yeah. So the movie we're going to watch is called Pride Denied: Homo Nationalism and the Future of Queer Politics. A really interesting documentary. I'll leave you to talk a little bit more about it when we get it set up, Alison. But so let's have a bit of a break and look at some books and eat some cookies.
Sounds good. And there are badges there. If you've ever come to talk to us before out in the park, we've got our usual badges there. If you want to take a badge or go away, go for it.